So welcome back, Social 10. We've been looking at the Industrial Revolution. We've been looking at ideologies. We've focused on capitalism. And we've been using these sources to help apply the ideologies so that we can test our understanding. The next ideology I want to talk about is socialism. So we've talked about capitalism. Now I want to talk about socialism. Now, in order to explain what is socialism, I want to contrast it with capitalism. Whereas capitalism is an economic system that creates inequality, socialism is an economic system that is attempting to create equality. So in my mind, that's the beginning of the difference, is that the end goal of socialism is equality, whereas the end result of capitalism is inequality. That's a major difference. So yesterday when we looked at ideologies, we looked at two groupings of ideologies, individualism and collectivism. Capitalism is individualism because it's promoting self-interest. Socialism is collectivism because it's promoting the interest of the collective, the common good. Under socialism, we have a responsibility to our brothers, to serve our brothers. We are our brother's keeper. So socialism is about promoting equality by having people serve the group. Capitalism results in inequality as people serve themselves. Socialism is about cooperation. Capitalism is about competition. And as a result of competition, we won't have equality. But as a result of cooperation, we will. So we've been looking at capitalism. Now I want to look at socialism. In the 19th century, a number of socialists were attempting to find a path to what they described as utopia. A perfect society, one where they would see equality. How can we achieve that? How do we get to equality? Well, after decades of not achieving it, many of them became frustrated, and they turned to an individual named Karl Marx, and they challenged Karl to come up with a path, a means to that end. How can we achieve equality? And Karl Marx did some research. He went to Manchester, went to Leeds. He went and observed the Industrial Revolution. He wanted to see the workers. And he came up with the conclusion that history is a history of class struggle. History had always been a history of class struggle, but for Karl Marx at the time that he was observing, the two classes were the dominant capitalist class, that he called the bourgeoisie, B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S-I-E. Yep, B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S-I-E. So this is his word for the capitalists, the factory owners, the bourgeoisie. And they were the dominant group because they controlled the means of production. And the other group, the workers, were the proletariat. Pro, P-R-O, let, L-E-T, A-R-I-A-T. So in the past, when we studied the Industrial Revolution, we talked about the bourgeoisie, and we mentioned how they were the nouveau riche. They were rich, but they were getting rich by robbing the value from their workers. So many critics called them robber barons. Karl Marx is observing this, that this nouveau riche, these new rich, the bourgeoisie, they're becoming wealthy and powerful because they are robbing the value from their workers. That Russ McBride might be working at a factory, and as a result of my work, I might create $100 of value that day in products that I've created, but I might get paid $1 in my salary. That's the reality that he sees. So Karl Marx believes that the workers will have a epiphany. And not an epiphany in the biblical sense, but something very similar. A moment of clarity. A sudden moment of clarity when you realize that you need to see something differently. It's like a paradigm shift of thinking. So in this moment, this epiphany, the workers will realize we're being exploited. That I'm getting paid a small fraction of the value of my work. So he said that following the epiphany, the workers will break the chains of oppression. Now for Iqbal, the story I shared with you earlier, those chains would have been literal. And there are hundreds of thousands of children literally chained oppressively today as slaves to our lifestyle. But when Karl Marx mentioned the chains of oppression in the 19th century, he was talking metaphorically. That they were being oppressed, they were being chained to the machines. And he believed that there would be an epiphany, an awakening, and the workers would rise up and violently take over the factories. So because they're rising up, using violence to try to do something new, that fits in with the term radicalism yesterday. So what is communism? At that time in the 19th century, it was a radical form of socialism. One that was believing in violence and authoritarianism as a means to an end. In a Machiavellian way that what we're doing now might be bloody and dirty, but in the end we'll achieve utopia, and that's what makes it worthwhile. So he says the workers will have an epiphany, they'll use violence, they'll take over the means of production, the factories, but the factory owners, they're not going to willingly just surrender their factories and say, okay, you win, you get the factory. The bourgeoisie, the nouveau riche, they have a vested interest in the old paradigm, in individualism. So they're going to cling to that with their own counterforce. So we're going to have a civil war between the bourgeoisie and their forces and the proletariat. And who wins the civil war? Well, whoever controls the factories, because the factories will be useful in creating munitions and rifles, things needed to win the war. And ultimately, because they have seized the means of production, the proletariat will win the civil war. But just because I've lost the war doesn't mean I'm going to quit. And in this scenario, I'm the bourgeoisie. I'm the capitalist. So Karl Marx suggested that following the Civil War, the proletariat will have to create a dictatorship. A dictatorship of the proletariat. And to some extent, we saw this in the Soviet Union. They have a Russian Revolution, the forces of the Bolsheviks win under Lenin, and then they create an authoritarian state under the Communist Party. A dictatorship of the proletariat. And it is the mission of the proletariat, the dictatorship, to convince everyone that a paradigm shift towards collectivism is the right thing to do. So how do you convince the people that used to own the factories that it's better to share and cooperate? Well, you need to create a paradigm shift. You need to win a war of hearts and minds. So this is going to be a war of hearts and minds. So how do you change the hearts and minds of the forces of opposition? Well, you're going to use things like indoctrination. So you're going to use indoctrination to lead people to new ideas, to adopting the proletariat's ideas. You're going to use propaganda. We call these things techniques of dictatorship. Indoctrination, propaganda. This is to help try to win the hearts and minds of the people. But there are some people that, maybe I'm 70 years old and you guys have created a dictatorship of the proletariat. And I don't know about you, but a lot of 70-year-olds, they're not ready to try something new, right? I'm pretty set in my ways already, and I'm not quite there yet. So when I get to 70, I'm probably going to be even more stubborn and more conservative. So for those people like me that may not want to change, you're going to use force and terror to intimidate me. You might put me in a concentration camp. You might have to purge me from society. You might have to kill me. So far, history is history of class struggle. At the time of Karl Marx, he sees the workers, the proletariat, being manipulated by the owners, the nouveau riche, the bourgeoisie. And he believed that the workers would have an epiphany, an awakening, that their values being robbed by the bourgeoisie. So that he believed that they would use violence to seize the means of production, but there would be a civil war because the bourgeoisie don't want to give up the means of production. And in the Civil War, the proletariat will win because they have the factories. But following that, it's going to be a dictatorship of the workers as they try to win a war of hearts and minds, as they try to convince people that a paradigm shift towards collectivism is the right thing to do. Because in the end, Karl Marx wants everybody to wake up in the morning and believe this. That what is my responsibility today? Well, to live this life. From each according to my ability, to each according to others' needs, right? That I need to work as hard as I can to help the group. That's the end goal. That when we begin to live for the group and not live for ourselves, then equality is going to be manifested. That's Marxism. So now we can look at that second source that you're seeing tomorrow and say a critic of capitalism would respond to the source by suggesting that what is the solution to the problem? So what is the problem? Problem is, just shout it out, slavery, exploitation, taking advantage of child workers. What's the solution that Karl Marx would say? We need a worker-led revolution. But the reason why we haven't seen it yet is because these two workers haven't had what? They haven't had their epiphany. And they haven't had their epiphany because instead of focusing on the exploitation, going back to source one to create a linear relationship, the reason why we haven't helped those exploited in source two is because we're distracted. Source one tells us we're distracted. What are we distracted by? Exactly. We're distracted by our computer pets that rest in our laps. We're distracted by our phones. So, rather than being concerned about the exploitation of these children, the most vulnerable people in our society, they don't even have shoes to protect their feet. There's definitely a number of occupational health safety concerns looking at this photograph. Instead of being concerned about them, I want to know what level of Candy Crush I can get to by the end of the night. I'm living in a world of a fetish. So, to some extent, we are distracted by a fetishism, and I'm going to mispronounce that, struggle on some words, where I'm more excited about consumerism and about commodities and that kind of lifestyle than about helping my fellow man. Instead of being a humanitarian, I'm just a selfish individualist. And it's a fetish. It's a spiraling cycle as I live for myself. At the end of the day, I don't care about you. At the end of the day, I care about myself. That's capitalism. I only care about what can I sell to you to make me stronger. That's capitalism. Unfortunately, capitalism brings us back to the ancient Athenians, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, that realist idea, and we see an element of realism here. They're suffering because they're being exploited. Now, source 3 is saying, no, the strong are actually helping the weak. Without the strong, the weak would die. So, source 3, Michael Walker, Fraser Institute, would disagree. Now, do we have some, the strong, in our society that help the weak? I'd like to introduce you to Robert Owen. Robert Owen is going to be the last thing we look at today. Robert Owen is a unique individual because when you look at his brief bio here, he's a manufacturer. So that makes me think he's a capitalist. He's a bourgeoisie. But then he's also a socialist. He's a reformer, and he believes in helping others, philanthropy. So wait a minute, we have a capitalist by profession. He owns the factory, who helps others. This gets my attention. This is someone whose occupation screams individualism, but whose actions scream collectivism. So what is the story of Robert Owen? Well, it's really the story of a community that he builds. And that community is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's in Scotland, and it's called New Lanark. And the reason why it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site is because it was so unique. So he's a capitalist. He's a manufacturer engaged in textiles industry. And he decides, before Gandhi makes the quote, he decides in a Gandhi-esque way to be the change you want to see for the world. So he looks at workers and he sees exploitation and suffering and poverty, and he says, you know what, I'm going to pay my workers more. I don't have to wait for government to regulate what I'm allowed to pay my workers with minimum wage legislation. I'm going to pay them more. I'm going to pay them more than market value. Henry Ford will do this later in America as well and help build the American middle class by doing it. I'm going to pay them more than the market demands because that's the right thing to do. I'm going to pay them more, but who's the them? I'm not going to employ children. I'm going to employ their parents. I'm going to employ the parents. Remember when we studied the Industrial Revolution, we looked at the changes, the transformative changes on the family structure? Well, he's saying, you know what? It doesn't have to happen like that. We can actually employ the adults. And for the children, I'm going to provide them school. They're going to get education. It used to be education was only for the rich. But he's saying, you know what? All of the children of my employees will get to go to school. I'm going to pay my workers more than they need to, market-wise. I'm going to educate their children. In our community, I'm going to build leisure activity. We'll have, outdoor courts that they can go and play in. We'll have parks. And so that I can make sure that they get to use those parks, I'm going to pay the workers more. I already addressed that. But I'm going to expect them to work less hours so they have leisure time. At this point in history, a lot of people were talking about 8, 8, and 8. 8 hours work, 8 hours leisure, 8 hours sleep and rest, right? He's going to make sure that his workers get leisure time. Time to spend with the family. Time to go to those parks. He's going to make sure that the consumable items that they need for their lifestyle that he's trying to elevate, to level up like the one source talks about, the ones that are for sale in the company store, they're going to be priced lower than market value. So the products that they need to live, like we've got this nice apple crisp muffin I'm looking forward to for lunch today, courtesy of Beans and the good people at H.J. Cody in Sylvan Lake that bought it for us, that the products at this store are going to be affordable so that nobody's living in poverty and desperation. Source 3, right? Desperation. How do we deal with poverty and desperation? Robert Owen says the company can actually provide products to the employees at less than market prices, including housing. So what is New Lanark? It's a place where everybody has a good house, everybody is well fed, they have leisure time, their kids have an education, and this was a revolutionary idea. Robert Owen is a socialist, but he's not a violent socialist. He's not an authoritarian socialist. He's not a communist. So the last ideology we're looking at today, it's not called Owenism, but it's just socialism. It's a different path to the same goal. Marx and Owen want the same goal, equality. They want to create more equality in society. But Marx believed that there weren't many Robert Owens in the world, and he was right. So Marx believed that violence would have to be the tool to unlock that. Robert Owen thought that maybe just compassion could unlock it. So the three main ideologies we've looked at, capitalism, Marxism, communism, and socialism. But other ideologies we've talked about in the past include realism and social Darwinism. We looked at two groupings, individualism and collectivism. And in the handout, you'll see some other ideologies. The handout meaning the lesson that's online. So that's it. That's the end of the lesson on ideologies for now. We'll come back to ideologies in grade 12.